I had to get rid of a whole lot of stuff to begin my process of finding my way to some peace, right? And then he comes to this really powerful word picture from Ezekiel, right? And God said, shall these bones live? Shall these bones live? And that which had been contained in the bones, which were already die, said chirping. So now we're, by the way, notice his verbs here, chirping. Now we're going to get the bones talking. Because of the goodness of this lady, this could again be Beatrice for Dante. It could be even Mathilde, as we talk about it in our lectures on Paradiso. It could be the Lady Philosophy in Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, as we've talked about it. Finally, many have read this as simply Vivian. He originally, his wife, actually did dedicate this poem to Vivian, so he may be referencing her here. The goodness of this lady, and because of her loveliness, because she honors the Virgin in meditation, we shine with brightness. And I, who am here dissembled, now this word dissembled is an important one. That is to say, before you can be put back together well, you have to be taken apart. In other words, there is a role to be played. We learned this in our study of Plato's Cave Allegory, Book 7 of Republic, that you got to go through some pain and some suffering. If you're going to get out of the darkness of the cave, looking at shadows on a wall that are images and not real, out into the light of the sun, and then of course once you get out there you're blinded by the light for a while before you finally can figure a few things out. So he says, I who am here dissembled, proffer my deeds to oblivion. We think about Elijah from the 1 Kings 19, again 1 through 8 passage, and my love to the posterity of the desert and the fruit of the gourd. Got all kinds of religious kinds of connotations going on here. In other words, whatever it is that I've done, whatever it is that I will do, Eliot says, claims at least to say, I am willing to give those things up to oblivion. Renunciation is, of course, the religious term for this. It is this which recovers my guts. And then this really interesting word picture, the strings of my eyes, although eyes and eyesight take us to Plato, and sight and perspicacity. Again, as we say it, insight versus outsight, as we might say, right? Wisdom. And the indigestible portions which the leopards reject. That is to say, in the end, there's certain parts the leopards are going to leave alone, okay, and that will be the essence or the stuff from which Eliot will grow his future life as a poet. The lady is withdrawn in a white gown, again, white colors here for Eliot will be about purity, to contemplation. We're still with our Plato here in a white gown. Let the whiteness of bones atone to forgetfulness. There is no life in them. As I am forgotten, we think of Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, a text we've studied together. Soon you will have forgotten all things, and all things will have forgotten you. We think about Shelley's Ozymandias as well. As I am forgotten and would be forgotten, so I would forget, thus devoted, consecrated in purpose. Again, that notion of sustained will, and that takes us back to our study of Shakespeare's Hamlet. Thus conscience makes cowards of us all. Why is it that we can't do the thing we want to do? And God said, now we got this speaking of God, prophesy to the wind. Obviously this is the Ezekiel passage, but I also want you to run down Pushkin's Prophet and read that poem and see just how powerfully analogous this idea is. I think that what Eliot is doing in Ash Wednesday, among all the other things that we're talking about, is that he's wanting to play the role of Tiresias one more time. Only now his vision is as an Old Testament prophet, pointing towards the dream, pointing towards the future. To this degree, we can't help but think about Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, and the fact that King himself will also echo very similar kinds of ideas in his speech, right, that are prophetic in nature. And God said, prophesy to the wind only, for only the wind will listen. And the bones sang, again the verb chirping, with the burden of the grasshopper, saying, Lady of silences. And again, this maybe is Mary by this point, symbolism of divine grace, we might say. Lady of silences, calm and distressed, torn and most whole. Whoa, 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 what's going on here? Put it in your notes. We're to the oxymorons. We are to the paradoxes. From Holloman, shape without form, shape without color, paralyzed force, gesture without motion. In other words, we're going to play the same game of paradoxes that we played in Holloman, only now, instead of being led towards despair, the hope only of empty men, as we'll hear of it in Holloman, now we're going to move towards the rose, which will be, of course, for Dante, the multifoliate rose. The hope only of empty men is what it's referred to in the hollow men, but here it's going to be the source of some kind of spiritual enlightenment. Calm and distressed, torn and most whole, rose of memory. Of course, we think about Dante immediately with this rose thing. Rose of forgetfulness, exhausted and life-giving, worried, reposeful, the single rose. Dante's obviously Paradiso, the communion of all saints represented by the rose. And of course, now put it in your notes as well. When we meet in Burnt Norton, the first of the 4 poems of 4 quartets, the lotus rose silently, or quietly, the surface glittered out of heart of light. This idea of the rose will be a powerful image for Eliot all the way. The single rose is now the garden. We can't help but think about the Genesis 3 story as well as Milton's Paradise Lost, where all love's end torment of love unsatisfied, the greater torment of love satisfied. And for Eliot himself, this was a huge question. Is it better to get what you want or to not get what you want in regards to love? Sometimes, be careful, you may say it this way, sometimes be careful what you wish for, you might get what you want, that kind of thing, right? We're playing a very similar game here. And then he uses the word, journey to no end. We think of Journey of the Magi, the other poem that he wrote after his conversion in 27, but obviously here I think that most importantly we've got to think about that motif of the journey in, of course, Homer and Virgil. That idea that the hero is defined by taking that journey, right? Conclusion of all that is inconclusible. Speech without word, and we're going to get to more of this thing about word and the logos in a bit, and word of no speech. Grace to the mother for the garden where all love ends. The ultimate goal. In other words, the final fruition. What is it that ultimately we want? Where all love ends, the coming to the conclusion of it all. And then we're back to the juniper tree again. Back to the juniper tree of Ezekiel 37, 1 through 14. The bones sang, scattered, and shining. And then the bones saying, we are glad to be scattered. I can't help but think that the final lines of Shelley's Ode to the West Wind is not probably, it's got to be somehow in T.S. Eliot's mind here. Remember, if winter come, can spring be far behind is what Shelley hopes. The idea, like ashes, will be scattered or spread to the universe, as we say in our lecture on that poem. We did little good to each other, the bones say anyway. In other words, there really wasn't much good, Eliot admits, from my writing such a great poem as Wasteland. Back to the tree motif here. Under a tree, in the cool of the day, Genesis 3:8, when God walks in the garden. I also want to point out our comments elsewhere on Learn Strong about Conrad's Heart of Darkness. We know how important Conrad's and Heart of Darkness was to Eliot from our study of Hollowman. You'll remember that grove scene of death, and I think here under a tree in the cool of the day with a blessing of sand. Again, we come back to Shelley's Ozymandias, don't we? Forgetting themselves and each other, united, which is always the goal in the quiet of the desert. Now, what is the desert? The desert fathers, as they're sometimes referred to in Christian teachings, as well as in Islamic teachings, as well as in Buddhist teachings. The desert often is the recognition of that place where one has to go to wait for, the voice of God or Allah. This is the land which ye shall divide by lot. Now, of course, this game of playing with Abraham and Lot, and the famous story of the division of the land and all of that. And neither division nor unity matters. The movement beyond contradictions to come to some kind of non-dual state, this is the ultimate goal. This is the land, right? Again, Ezekiel 48:29 comes to mind here. We have our inheritance. In other words, the idea that somehow or another we can finally come to some real answer of what it is. What is our inheritance? What is it that we will claim as being true? Well, let's finish now with part 2 and 2a. The challenge, obviously, of letting go to get going. The leopards, obviously, will always be there. You got to destroy the things that are holding you back to get the thing that you want. At 2b, obviously, the symbolism of the rose. At 3a, we mentioned Dante and obviously Ezekiel the prophet. Finally, at 3b for this part, why is sustained will so hard? I mean, you can say, I'm going to do X, but then we have this tendency to forget so quickly. Why is letting go, or as we sometimes call it, transcending and including, so hard, right? Why is that the case? Let's turn now to part 3, and at part 3, by the end of part 3, we're halfway through this poem. The mystical turn is now going to be described as going both downwards as well as upwards. I mean, if you'll think about it on a globe, right? And pick any point and just start going south, and soon enough you'll be going north. Pick any point and start going north, and pretty soon you'll be going south, right? That is the power of this word picture and the mystical turn, both downwards in part 4, upwards in downwards in part 3, upwards in part 4. And as well, we're going to now have this stair climbing image, this spiraling staircase, which we have to think about Yeats and his second coming, turning in the widening gyre and all of that. And that notion of spinning, right? Okay, so as we go to part 3 now, let's enjoy that one.
At the first turning of the second stair, I turned and saw below the same shape twisted on the banister, under the vapour in the fetid air, struggling with the devil of the stairs, who wears the deceitful face of hope and of despair. At the second turning of the second stair, I left them twisting, turning below. There were no more faces, and the stair was dark, damp, jagged, like an old man's mouth, drivelling beyond repair, or the toothed gullet of an aged shark. At the first turning of the third stair was a slotted window, bellied like the fig's fruit, and beyond the hawthorn blossom and the pasture scene, the broad-backed figure dressed in blue and green enchanted the Maytime with an antique flute. Blown hair is sweet, brown hair over the mouth blown, lilac and brown hair, distraction, music of the flute, stops and steps of the mind over the third stair, fading, fading, strength beyond hope and despair, climbing the third stair. Lord, I am not worthy, Lord, I am not worthy, but speak the word only.
All right. So the third section, you'll notice, is very, very short as compared to the second. Here, we're going to work with one of those really famous word pictures, the idea of ascending. I mean, go back to our lecture that we gave recently on Amanda Gorman's classic. Already, I'm calling it a classic. Why do we call it a classic? Any story that speaks to our now is going to be, for us in 303, a classic. The Hill We Climb. Think about the influence of Dante in our thinking about this as well. And now, imagine that he's turning as he's going up these stairs, right? And at the first turning of the second stair, by the way, note the end rhyme here, stair, banister, air, wares. Okay, so we've got this kind of lilting type of language. It's quite remarkably beautiful. At the first turning of the second stair, I turned and saw below, and this is so much our Dante language, right? I mean, as we were reading both Inferno and Purgatorio would play this game, right? The same twisted shape. Now, of course, twists here, we think about the very portrayal from Milton of Satan as he is twisting as a snake coming towards Eve. Go back to our lectures on that one. And here, notice this demon of doubt might be the description of the twisted on the banister. Under the vapor in the fetid air, struggling with the devil of the stairs, who wears the deceitful face of hope and despair. Go back to our lines, you'll remember from the Hollow Men, between the idea and the reality, between the emotion and the act falls the shadow, for thine is the kingdom. We're playing a very similar kind of game here. In other words, when he says, when I stop and I look back to where I've been, one of the things I'm reminded of is that deceitful face of hope and despair. Then the second turning, right, of the second stair. I left them twisting, second time, right, the word twist gets used here. Turning below, we think about Yeats, as we said, Geyer, right, the sinner cannot hold, as he says it in the second coming. There were no more faces, and the stair was dark. We think of the dark night of the soul. Damp, jagged, and then we get an interesting simile and a metaphor. Like an old man's mouth dribbling. I should have gone through narrow streets, he will say, watching old men with pipes leaning out of windows in proof rock, playing a very similar kind of game here. Like an old man's mouth driveling beyond repair. Or the metaphor, the second one, the toothed gullet of an aged shark. Note all the animals in this poem, and notice how they are, many of them, eagles, leopards, sharks. They're all kind of animals that can be really vicious. Only notice here, it's now an aged shark, maybe he himself identifying with the idea that all great whites sooner or later have to become less than great, right? There was a slotted, at the first turning of the third stair, he says, there was a slotted window, bellied like the fig's fruit. Now, of course, we think about fruit, we immediately think about Milton in Genesis 3. We think about figs, and we think about the story of Christ and the fig tree, right? And beyond the hawthorn blossom, all of the flower imageries. Go ahead and write this down. This is one of the reasons we study this poem before we do 4 quartets, because we're going to have all kinds of flowers imagery that will come up in our studies of all 4 of the poems of the 4 quartets, right? And as well a pasture scene. We're gonna have a bunch of those scenes as well. The broad-backed figure dressed in blue and green. Colors here matter. Blue and white usually are the holy colors. Blue, green, and brown are usually more the earthly colors, right? The more secular colors, we might say. The broad-backed figure dressed in blue and green enchanted the Maytime. We, of course, are immediately going to think about the hollow man. Here we go round the prickly pear. Here it's the Maytime with an antique flute. Now, I'm convinced that you can't read T.S. Eliot, as I've said in other lectures, without a full appreciation of his appreciation of Keats. Here, of course, we're thinking about Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn, and those soft pipes play on and all of that. Then we will get the genesis for the line that will come in Burnt Norton, the first of the 4 poems, distracted from distraction by distraction. Blown hair is sweet, brown hair over the mouth blown, lilac and brown hair. Lilac, we're going to meet as well, again, from Wasteland, maybe past loves, and brown hair. And then he says it, distraction. Music of the flute stops, and steps of the mind over the third stair. And the key of over is the key here, right? That is to say, transcendence, to move beyond. Then we're to Keats's Nightingale. So I feel in many ways part 4 is the Keats part of this poem more than any other parts. You'll remember that we said the F word of the key of Keats's poem Ode to a Nightingale is fading, the fade word, right? Fading, strength beyond hope and despair. Well, this is it, right? The ultimate goal is harmony or balance in the spiritual existence, climbing the third stair. And then he'll quote from Matthew 8:8, Lord, I'm not worthy, but speak the word only. We're going to get back to this thing of the word. The word in the desert is most attacked by voices of temptation. The crying shadow and the funeral dance, the loud lament, the disconsolate chimera are the lines that will come for us in 4 quartets at the end of Burnt Norton. Okay, let's play the game really quickly of 2A, right? To go forward, we've said you got to let go, right, of your past. You got to overcome doubt as well to move forward. Skepticism is no answer long term, right? You've got to find something to believe in. Now, often students will say, well, yeah, but the absolutist position epistemologically is so dangerous. I mean, people fly airplanes into buildings and kill lots of people because of that kind of insanity. So I'm just going to go ahead and say that nothing is true. One problem with that is I recognize I just said something I think to be true. To what degree then can I epistemologically hold a position? I think that's being outlined here for us. That is to say, you got to overcome some doubt. You got to hold on to some ideas and say about those ideas, I think I'm right, but I could be wrong. It's that I could be wrong that is central, of course, to our education. At 2B, notice the role of colors here as symbolism. Notice that we as well have the word pictures of this climbing the stairs so that one can look kind of backwards, right? At 3A, as we said, a lot of Keats. I would also echo that there's a whole lot of St. Augustine going on here as well. Finally, at 3B, a question for you personally. What have you had to learn to let go of so that you could go forward? All of us have had to deal with addictions of some kind or another. And of course, that part of the dealing with addiction is learning how to live alongside of it, learning how to live beyond it. But how have you learned how to do that? Well, let's go to part 4 and the mystical turn now that moves upwards. We're going to get to the lady, and we're going to have a lot of references to yew tree. So write this down right away at 2b. Our symbolism here will be the yew tree. We're going to see a lot about the yew tree in 4 quartets. If you're unfamiliar with this tree, go to Google Images really quickly and take a look at it. Dude, it's the weirdest looking tree, the way it grows up and then down right into the ground. We see them often in graveyards, especially in old graveyards of Europe and back in New England area. And to that degree, the yew tree is a symbol for death, okay? So here we go, part 4, and we're going to mess around as well with some colors again in violet.
Who walked between the violet and the violet, who walked between the various ranks of varied green, going in white and blue in Mary's colour, talking of trivial things, in ignorance and in knowledge of eternal dollar, who moved among the others as they walked, who then made strong the fountains and made fresh the springs, made cool the dry rock and made firm the sand, in blue of larkspur, blue of Mary's colour, Sylvania Rus. Here are the years that walk between, bearing away the fiddles and the flutes, restoring one who moves in the time between sleep and waking, wearing white light folded, sheathed about her, folded. The New Year's walk restoring through a bright cloud of tears, the years restoring with a new verse the ancient rhyme. Redeem the time, redeem the unread vision in the higher dream, while jeweled unicorns draw by the gilded hearse. The silent sister veiled in white and blue between the yews, behind the garden god, whose flute is breathless, bent her head and signed but spoke no word. But the fountain sprang up